know how sometimes everything just falls into place? That's exactly how it felt when I met Daniel. I had been swiping through countless profiles on the dating app, not expecting much. But then there he was, Daniel. His profile wasn't flashy, but it was charming. He seemed down-to-earth, smart, and honestly a little missed. We started chatting, and everything flowed so naturally. After just a few days of messaging back and forth, we decided to meet up for dinner. I was nervous, but excited. You know, the kind of butterflies you get. The date itself was, in one word, perfect. Daniel was even more handsome in person. Tall, confident, with this easy smile that made me feel instantly at ease. He held doors for me, pulled out my chair, and knew all the right things to say. We laughed, we talked about everything from our favorite books to traveling. I found myself thinking, this guy, he could be the one. By the end of the night, I was genuinely impressed. Daniel walked me to my car, and before I knew it, I found myself hoping for a second date. I mean, who wouldn't? He was everything you'd want in someone. Attentive, polite, and just easy to be around. Little did I know, this picture-perfect date was just the beginning. What seemed like the start of something wonderful would soon turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. But then, things started to feel off. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to brush off as excitement, or maybe even flattery. Daniel would send me messages constantly. At first, I thought it was sweet, checking in to see how my day was going. But soon, it turned into these rapid-fire texts, asking where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. I tried to convince myself that he was just being attentive. We had a great first date, right? Maybe he was just really into me, but it started to get overwhelming. If I didn't reply right away, he'd send another message, and then another, and another. At first, it was innocent, just questions about my day, but then he began asking why I hadn't answered yet. If I said I was busy, he'd question what I was doing that made me so busy. One night, I was out with some friends. We were having drinks, just a casual night out, when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "What are you up to?" he asked. I told him I was out with friends and didn't think much of it. But then, not even 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed again, and again. The messages kept coming. "Where are you exactly? Who's there? Are there guys with you?" Felt like a switch had flipped. What had started as sweet concern now felt controlling. I remember sitting there, staring at my phone, feeling uneasy for the first time. Why was he acting like this? We had just met, after all. I tried to set some boundaries, telling him I needed some space, but it only made things worse. He'd apologize, say he was just worried about me, that he cared. But then, the very next day, it would start all over again. The texts, the questions, the constant need to know where I was. It was like he couldn't stand not being in control. That perfect first date suddenly felt like a distant memory. The Daniel I met that night, the charming, easygoing guy, was slowly disappearing, and in his place, I was starting to see someone much darker, someone I wasn't prepared for. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong, so I decided to do a little digging, just to ease my mind. At first, it was just a casual search, scrolling through social media, looking for anything about Daniel. But what I found, well, it wasn't what I expected. There wasn't much on his profiles, just a few vague posts, nothing that really matched the image he had painted during our date. That's when I dug deeper, Googling his name, trying different spellings. And then I found it. Buried in an old news article, there it was, his name, his face. I felt my stomach drop. Daniel had been involved in a domestic violence case a few years back, accused of stalking and harassment by a previous girlfriend. Couldn't believe it. I stared at the screen, rereading the article, hoping I had made a mistake, that this wasn't the same Daniel. But it was. The more I looked, the more I found. There were police reports, court records. The pattern was clear. This wasn't the first time he had acted like this. It was like I was seeing a stranger, not the man I'd met that night. Panic started to creep in. I had to get out of this before it went any further. But how do you confront someone like that? What if he reacted badly? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't just ghost him. He already knew too much about me, where I lived, where I worked. Felt like I was trapped. I knew I had to be smart about this, careful. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the fear that I was dealing with someone dangerous. Someone who had done this before, and I had no idea how far he'd be willing to go this time. I knew I couldn't just stay quiet and hope he'd go away. So, I decided to confront him carefully, over text. I didn't want to meet in person. Something told me that would be a mistake. I kept it simple, saying I'd looked into some things and that I wasn't comfortable continuing to see him. I thought that if I was firm but respectful, maybe he'd take the hint and back off. But he didn't. Instead, he blew up. The messages started pouring in, angrier and more intense than ever. At first, it was all about how I was wrong, how people had lied about him in the past. He claimed he'd changed, that what happened before wasn't his fault. Then, when I didn't respond, his tone shifted. The texts got darker. He started saying things like, "You can't just ghost me, and you think you can just walk away?" I was shaking as I read each message. My phone would buzz, and my heart would race, not knowing what I'd see next. Then came the scariest part. He showed up at my apartment. I hadn't told him where I lived, but somehow he found out. It was late one night, and I was home alone when I heard the knock. At first, I thought it was a neighbor, but when I looked through the peephole, there he was, Daniel. My stomach twisted in knots. He stood there, looking angry, pacing back and forth outside my door. I didn't open it, couldn't. I just stood there, frozen, listening to him knock harder and harder, calling my name, demanding I talk to him. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. After what felt like an eternity, he finally left. But that didn't stop the texts. He knew I was there. He knew I hadn't answered. And now I was terrified. I realized then, this wasn't just someone being possessive. This was someone who wasn't going to let go easily. And I didn't know what he was capable of next. That night, after he finally left, I didn't sleep. I kept thinking, what's he going to do next? Is he coming back? Every sound outside, every creak in the apartment, made me jump. I knew I couldn't keep living like that, in fear. I had to do something. The next morning, I went straight to the police. I explained everything, from the messages to him showing up at my apartment. Thankfully, they took it seriously. They advised me to file for a restraining order, and they sent patrols around my neighborhood to keep an eye out. But even with the police involved, I couldn't shake the fear that he'd come back. What if he didn't care about the law? What if this made him even angrier? A few nights later, my worst fear came true. I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with a movie, when I heard something outside again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was the sound of someone trying to force the door open. My heart stopped. I knew it was him. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering into the phone as I hid in the closet, praying the police would get there in time. The minutes felt like hours, and the noise at the door got louder. I could hear him muttering angrily to himself. He was trying to get in. Then, suddenly, there were flashing lights outside, and I heard the police shouting. They had arrived just in time. Daniel tried to run, but they caught him right there on the front lawn. I stayed hidden until I was sure it was over. When I finally stepped outside, they had him in handcuffs. He was yelling about how I had ruined his life, how I couldn't get away with this. But in that moment, I knew I was finally safe. It was over, but the fear lingered. Even after Daniel was arrested and charged with harassment and attempted breaking and entering, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd always have to look over my shoulder. That perfect first date? It was nothing but a mask, hiding the danger underneath. And I learned, in the hardest way possible, that sometimes the most charming people can hide the darkest intentions. You know how they say the past has a funny way of creeping back into your life? That's exactly what happened to me. I was on a dating app just looking for something casual, no big expectations. After a few weeks of swiping, I matched with a guy named Matt. He seemed nice enough. Good conversation, friendly, easy to talk to. We had a couple of decent dates. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the typical getting to know you kind of stuff. But then, during one of our dates, he casually brought up my ex out of nowhere. He said something like, "I think I know your ex, Jeremy, right?" And I froze for a second, because how the hell did he know about Jeremy? I hadn't mentioned him at all, hadn't even thought about him in months. I tried to laugh it off, but it stuck with me. The more Matt talked, the more I realized he didn't just know of Jeremy. He actually knew him. They had mutual friends, apparently, ran in some of the same circles. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, we all have exes, right? But the way Matt brought him up, it felt strange, like he was digging for something. Then he asked, "So, what really happened between you two?" And I knew this wasn't just a coincidence anymore. It was weird. Too weird. My gut told me something was off, but I tried to brush it aside. I told myself, it's just a small world, but deep down I could feel that something wasn't right. I just didn't know yet how deep that connection went, or how dangerous it was about to become. After that conversation, things started to change. Subtly at first, but enough for me to notice. Matt's questions became more personal, more pointed. He started asking about Jeremy a lot. At first, it seemed like he was just curious, but soon it felt like he was trying to get information. Details about our breakup, how long we were together, even how things ended between us. I tried to steer the conversations away from my ex, but Matt would always bring him back up. It was like Jeremy was a third person in our dates, always looming over us. One night, he straight up asked, "Do you ever still talk to him?" That question sent chills down my spine. I hadn't spoken to Jeremy in over a year, and I had no plans to. We ended things on bad terms, really bad terms. He was controlling, manipulative, and when I finally broke it off, he didn't take it well. There had been threats, the occasional text where he tried to intimidate me, but eventually he just faded out of my life. Or at least I thought he had. Matt's fixation on him started to feel obsessive. I could sense that something was off. He wasn't just asking out of curiosity anymore. It felt like he had a deeper reason for digging into my past with Jeremy. I could see it in his eyes, he was pushing for something, but I couldn't figure out what. It wasn't long after that when Matt's behavior became controlling. It started small. He wanted to know where I was going, who I was with. If I didn't respond to his texts right away, he'd ask why. Then, one night, he showed up unannounced at my apartment, saying he was just in the neighborhood. At that point, the warning signs were flashing bright red, but I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. I thought, he's probably just concerned, but deep down I knew this wasn't concern. This was control, and I was about to learn just how far Matt was willing to go to get what he wanted. Then one night, it all started to make sense, and not in a good way. I was out with some friends, trying to clear my head, and I got a message from Matt. "Having fun?" he asked. It was weird because I hadn't told him I was going out. I hadn't even posted anything online about it. My heart started racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew exactly where I was. When I got home later that night, I decided to do something I should have done sooner. I started digging into his life. I went through his social media again, looking for any clues that might explain his strange behavior. That's when I found it. A few years back, Matt and Jeremy had been tagged in some old photos together. They weren't just acquaintances, they were friends, close friends. My stomach dropped. It all started to click into place. The questions about Jeremy, the weird fixation on my past with him. I realized that Matt wasn't interested in me at all. This had all been about Jeremy from the start. I couldn't help but wonder, was Matt doing this on his own? Or was Jeremy behind it, somehow pulling the strings? I confronted Matt the next time we met. I needed answers. "Why didn't you tell me you were friends with Jeremy?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I could see the surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to find out. But instead of denying it, he just smiled. Cold, unsettling smile. "That's what this has been about, hasn't it?" I said, my voice shaking now. "This wasn't a coincidence. You've been talking to him, haven't you?" Matt didn't even try to lie. He admitted it. He told me that Jeremy had reached out to him, that Jeremy still had unfinished business with me. I felt sick. I had spent months thinking I was moving on, building something new with someone else, but in reality, I had been walking straight into a trap set by my ex. I realized, right then and there, I had to get out, but leaving wasn't going to be as easy as I thought. I knew I had to cut ties with Matt immediately, but how? He already knew so much about me, where I lived, where I worked, my routines. And now, knowing he was working with Jeremy, I had to be careful. I tried to keep my cool as I told Matt I needed some space, saying things had moved too fast and I wasn't ready for a relationship. He didn't take it well. His response was eerily calm, but his eyes told a different story. "You're not going to get away from this that easily," he said, almost under his breath. I could feel the tension building. It was like something inside him had snapped. That night, I blocked his number, deleted all our chats, and locked every door and window in my apartment. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Matt wasn't just going to disappear. The next day, it started. I began receiving anonymous texts, messages that were too personal to be from a stranger. "You can't just walk away like that. Jeremy says hello." My blood ran cold. It was them. Both of them. Somehow, Jeremy had gotten involved again, pulling the strings, watching from the shadows, using Matt as his puppet. The texts kept coming, threats, reminders of how much they knew about me, as if they were letting me know that no matter where I went, they'd be watching. One night, I was driving home late from work, and I saw a car in my rearview mirror. It had been behind me for a while, but I didn't think much of it until it followed me street after street, turn after turn. My heart pounded as I sped up, hoping I was just being paranoid. But when I pulled into my apartment complex, the car parked a little way down the street, its headlights still on. I ran inside, locked the door, and called the police. But when they arrived, the car was gone, and there was no trace of Matt or Jeremy. The officers told me to stay vigilant, but that wasn't much comfort. I was living in fear now, constantly looking over my shoulder, always wondering when they'd show up again. It felt like I was being hunted, and I knew that sooner or later, something was going to happen. I just didn't know when. A few days later, things escalated. It was late, past midnight, when I heard a loud bang on my front door. My heart stopped. I knew it had to be them. My phone buzzed at the same time, a new message lighting up the screen. "You should have stayed quiet." My hands were shaking as I called the police, my voice barely a whisper as I explained that someone was outside my door. While I waited for them to arrive, I stayed hidden in the back room, clutching my phone, listening to the sound of someone trying to force the door open. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I could hear them talking, voices muffled, but I knew it was Matt and Jeremy. They were here to finish what they started. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, but where would I go? I was trapped inside my own home, and they were already in. Just as I was about to make a desperate move, I saw the flashing lights outside. The police had arrived. The sound of sirens filled the air, and then shouting. Everything was happening at once. I stayed hidden as the officers stormed in, and it wasn't until they called my name that I finally emerged, still shaking. They caught Matt in the hallway, and Jeremy was waiting in the car outside. They had come together, just like I'd feared, and they had no intention of leaving without a confrontation. As they were being led away in handcuffs, I could hear Matt shouting, "This isn't over. You'll see." But deep down, I knew that it was over. They had been caught, and I was finally safe. In the days that followed, I learned more about their plan, how Jeremy had manipulated Matt, using his insecurities and their past friendship to get to me. It was all about control, revenge for ending things with Jeremy, for trying to move on. And Matt had been his willing accomplice. It was terrifying to think about how close they had come, how easily they had wormed their way into my life, disguised as something normal, something innocent. But in the end, they failed, and I survived. Started like any other modern romance. I met Alex on a dating app. His profile? It was perfect. He wasn't trying too hard like some of the guys on there. He came across as smart, well-traveled, and genuinely kind. There was a picture of him hiking in the mountains, another of him sipping coffee at some cozy cafe. Everything about him screamed laid back and confident. We hit it off right away. After a few days of texting, we decided to meet for coffee. I'll admit, I was nervous, but the moment I walked in and saw him sitting at the table, that nervousness melted away. Alex was exactly how I imagined. Charming, easy to talk to, and just comfortable. He made me laugh, and that was something I hadn't experienced on a first date in a while. He talked about his job, working in finance, about his love for travel. He'd been to places I could only dream of. He had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, like everything I said mattered. We spent hours at that cafe, lost in conversation. By the time we said goodbye, I was already thinking about our next date. He walked me to my car, gave me a warm smile, and said, "I had a great time. Let's do this again soon." And honestly, I believed him. Everything felt right, like maybe I'd found someone who was genuinely worth getting to know. I left that night thinking, this guy, he could be different, but as perfect as that first encounter felt, I had no idea what I was really getting myself into. No idea who Alex really was beneath that charming surface. Things started off great after that first date. Alex was attentive, sweet, and seemed genuinely interested in me. We kept texting and went on a few more dates. Dinner, a walk in the park, even a movie night. Everything was so easy with him. Almost too easy. I couldn't help but think how lucky I was. But then, little things started to stand out. Things I probably should have noticed sooner. He rarely talked about his friends or family, which at first didn't seem like a big deal. Maybe he was just private. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized he never mentioned specific details. There were no old stories, no casual anecdotes about childhood or funny memories. It was like his past was a blank slate. Then came the social media. I didn't think much of it when I couldn't find him on Facebook or Instagram at first. Some people just aren't into social media, right? But after a few weeks, curiosity got the best of me. I asked him about it casually, like, "So, you're not really into social media, huh?" He smiled, that same charming smile, and said something about how he preferred to keep his life private. He made it sound so normal, like it wasn't strange at all. But I couldn't shake this feeling. That little voice in the back of my mind telling me something wasn't adding up. I'd never met anyone who didn't have some kind of online presence. I brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking. But then, another red flag, his stories. They didn't always match up. One day he told me he had just gotten back from a business trip. But then, a week later, he slipped and mentioned being in town that same weekend. I let it slide, thinking maybe I had misunderstood. But it kept happening. Little things, small inconsistencies that added up, bit by bit. It was around that time I started to wonder, who really was this guy I was dating? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every little inconsistency started gnawing at me, so one night, I decided to dig deeper. I knew it wasn't the most honest thing to do, but I needed answers. I started with a simple search, just his name, his job, anything that could connect him to the real world. First, nothing came up. No LinkedIn profile, no mentions of him at all in the industry he claimed to work in. It was like Alex didn't exist outside of our dates. My stomach tightened. I tried different variations of his name, but still nothing. Then, I remembered something he had mentioned in passing, a company he supposedly worked for. I searched for that, and finally, I found something, but not what I expected. There were news articles from a few years back, talking about an internal investigation at that same company, about a man who had been caught scamming clients and disappearing with their money. My heart sank as I saw the name, Alex's name. I clicked on the article, and there it was, his face, the same charming smile that had swept me off my feet. But this wasn't the man I thought I knew. The article detailed how Alex, or whatever his real name was, had been using fake identities for years, slipping through the cracks by reinventing himself over and over again. The company hadn't been able to track him down after he fled, and no one knew where he had gone. Couldn't believe it. Everything he had told me, everything he had shared, it was all a lie. The trips, the career, even his name, none of it was real. I felt sick. How could I have been so blind? I knew I had to confront him, but I couldn't shake the fear of what he might do if I did. The man I thought I was dating wasn't just hiding something. He was a complete stranger, and worse, a criminal. I had to be careful. I knew I had to confront him, but I also knew I couldn't do it impulsively. This wasn't just about a guy lying on a dating app. This was about someone with a history of fraud, someone who had perfected the art of deception. I had no idea what he was capable of if he felt cornered. So I planned carefully. I asked a close friend for advice and decided that when I confronted him, it would be in a public place. Somewhere safe where he couldn't lash out or try anything drastic. I texted him, acting like nothing had changed, like everything was fine. I suggested we meet at our usual cafe, where we had our first date. He agreed without hesitation. When I saw him sitting there, looking as calm and charming as ever, it took everything in me to keep my cool. I sat down across from him, pretending like this was just another casual meetup, but my heart was pounding. After some small talk, I couldn't hold back any longer. I leaned in and said, "Alex, or whatever your real name is, who are you? Really?" His expression didn't change at first. He just stared at me, like he was trying to figure out how much I knew. "I know about the lies," I continued. "The fake name, the company scandal. I found the articles." For a split second, something flashed in his eyes. Panic, maybe anger, but it was gone just as quickly as it came. He smiled, that same easy smile that had fooled me from the beginning, and said, "I think you've got the wrong guy. I wasn't buying it." "No, I don't. I've seen your picture. I know what you did. So, why don't you tell me the truth now, before things get worse?" That's when his whole demeanor shifted. The charm faded, and I could see the real Alex, cold, calculating. He leaned forward, his voice low and controlled. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. "And if you're smart, you'll drop this." My heart raced, but I didn't back down. "I'm not dropping anything. I'm done being lied to." He stood up abruptly, his face hard and unreadable. "You'll regret this," he muttered before walking out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there, shaken but determined. I knew then that I had to act fast. Whatever game he had been playing, it wasn't over yet, and now I was right in the middle of it. After that confrontation, I knew things were far from over. The look in Alex's eyes as he walked away, it wasn't just anger, it was a warning, and I had no idea how far he was willing to go to protect his secrets. For a few days, I didn't hear from him. No calls, no texts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. I started to notice things. Small things at first. My car's headlights were on one morning, even though I was sure I had turned them off the night before. Once, I came home and found the door to my apartment slightly ajar, though nothing seemed out of place inside. It was subtle, but it was enough to put me on edge. Then the text started again. Not from his number, but from unknown ones, short, cryptic messages like, "You don't know who you're dealing with," and "I'm not done yet." Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, and I felt trapped in this endless cycle of paranoia and fear. I went to the police, but without direct threats or proof that it was him. They couldn't do much. They advised me to change my locks, be cautious, and to keep them updated. I did everything they said. I installed security cameras, stayed with a friend for a few nights, and tried to be as careful as possible. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex wasn't done with me yet. One night, I was walking to my car after work when I felt it, that eerie sensation of being watched. I quickened my pace, looking over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him. Alex, standing in the shadows, watching me from across the street. My heart dropped. I fumbled for my phone, ready to call for help, but before I could dial, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a ghost. That was it. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to strike again. I went back to the police, this time with the footage from my security cameras. Footage that clearly showed Alex lurking around my building late at night. With that evidence, they took me seriously. A restraining order was filed, and they launched a formal investigation into his background. Turns out Alex, or whatever his real name was, had done this before. I wasn't his first victim. He had a trail of fake identities and manipulative relationships behind him, all with the same pattern: charm, deceit, and control. But this time he was caught. The police tracked him down, and I finally got the call I'd been waiting for. Alex had been arrested. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the realization that I had come so close to something far worse. The man I thought I was dating was a complete stranger, a dangerous one at that. And if I hadn't trusted my gut and started digging, who knows what would have happened. In the end, I survived. But the scars of being deceived like that, they run deep. I'll never look at dating the same way again, that's for sure. And now, I'm more cautious, more aware, because sometimes the person sitting across from you on that perfect first date isn't who they seem at all.